Good evening.
Look around out in our audience and see this crowd of people. You can tell how happy we are because look at the smiles on my fellow councilmen's faces. And just said, oh gosh, this is the biggest crowd we've had in a long time. And we're always glad to have you here. So I say to you right now, welcome to our fourth meeting for the month of February. We are so glad to have you here. And at this time, I would ask by invocation to be given by Councilman Matt Harvey. Respect to the flag by Councilman John Robertson. Please rise.
Let us pray. Dear Lord, thank you for letting us live in a free country. I pray for our world that you would bring unity and human compassion. I pray for our city that you would keep our citizens safe and healthy. I pray for our administration, our staff, and everyone that works daily to serve our citizens, that you would guide them to make good decisions. I pray for our police and our firefighters. They rush to harm's way to please keep them safe. And I pray for this council that we would make decisions pleasing to you that bring unity and compassion to our great city. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag.
At this time, we, as I said before, are so glad to have the crowd here tonight. And I would ask Mr. John Corbett to introduce the young people sitting over here. Mr. Corbett, would you come up front, please?
Come to the microphone.
Yes.
Thank you, City Council members. It is my honor and privilege to introduce to you the future leaders of Anderson. We represent two troops, Troop 215, Anderson, South Carolina, and the new Girls Troop 315, Anderson, South Carolina. If we have a moment, would it be okay if they introduce themselves? Okay. Guys, if you don't mind, stand, state your name and rank. Second class. And I'm John Corbett, also Assistant Scoutmaster. One of the things that we have in the scouting is citizenship in the community and citizenship in the world. This satisfies one of those requirements for these people. Thank you very much for allowing us to be here.
If you'd like to stay for the meeting, you're welcome. If not, you can leave if you want to.
Got a good-looking bunch of future leaders, I can tell you that. Absolutely. And by the way, my son was an Eagle Scout out of Troop 215. So keep going.
Okay, we will now begin our meeting with approval of the minutes of February 14th, 2022.
Approved.
Moved by, motion by Councilman Cowell, and second
Counselor Tony.
All in favor? Okay. All right, we have no old business, so we'll move down to new business. The first thing on our agenda is to request consideration of a referral to the Planning Commission, a petition to rezone lots 38 and 39 on River Heights Circle from R5 single-family residential, H1 heavy industrial. David?
Mayor Pro Tem, this is a referral to the Planning Commission, which meets tomorrow, March the 1st. The property has been posted. I went by there today to take a look at that. And Mr. Maurice McKenzie, our Planning Development Director, will go through the details. Mr. McKenzie.
Thank you. Again, this request is to rezone these two lots on River Heights Circle from R5 single-family residential to HI heavy industrial. The request is to construct a new building to be used for an existing industry that's across the street. They're wishing to expand. The name of the business is Carolina Custom Converting, which essentially converts large rolls of film to smaller rolls of film for various uses in the marketplace. And they're just needing extra space to expand, particularly from a storage perspective. It looks like they're wanting to construct a 60 by 80, generally speaking, size building on that piece of property. And again, it's zoned R5 single-family residential, so that essentially allows single-family houses on lots that are 5,000 square feet. Obviously, it does not allow any type of industrial use, so that's why they're wishing to rezone this piece of property. Interestingly enough, on either side of this lot, you have industrial-type buildings, storage-type buildings, but they are zoned residential as well. They're non-conforming. So you still have that industrial feel on that side of the street for about a block or so, even though it is zoned R5 single-family residential. But again, this is a referral to the Planning Commission. This will come back to you at your first meeting in March. So we recommend that you refer this to the Planning Commission. And again, as Mr. McEwen said, they meet tomorrow, March 1st.
Any questions from council members?
I believe this is in the area that I serve, but how do those non-conforming uses come into existence?
They have been there, obviously, you can tell, for a long time. And when the zoning ordinance was created, sometimes there's pieces of property that either were missed or sometimes non-conforming properties are good. Say, for instance, if there's a industrial piece of property in a sea of residential, you want that to be zone residential, so it's non-conforming, so eventually it would convert over to residential. In this particular case, I don't think that's what we would really see. I believe that when we go to the process of revising our zoning ordinance and map, we take a closer look at this area because it may not depict what really is the highest and best use for this property.
Because we've had some changes there. I mean, we had Clemson Hydraulics come in just down the road. As I went by there today, they're very active. They've done well in the city on their engineering and what they do within the warehouse space. And we got there. You know, there's some other activity in there, and so we're getting more and more interest actually in that area.
Could I amend this request to include those two adjacent properties to be rezoned into heavy industrial?
Consult with the city attorney about that. I would assume we would need the permission of the property owners, but that would be about it.
Wouldn't you have to, wouldn't you have to allow for proper advertisement instead of doing it? I don't think you can just amend it right now because those other two parcels haven't been properly advertised. Is that correct?
I can talk with the city attorney about.
Correct. So if you did that, this item wouldn't make it to the tomorrow's meeting because you would need the 15-day advertisement before the Planning Commission if you made that amendment. What I would propose doing, Jeff is moving this one along, and then we can take a look at the map and talk to those owners, and then make an amendment to the zoning map separately instead of trying to combine it into this one.
It just makes sense to include those three properties.
Active use.
Pattern across the street.
Any other comments?
Motion, we refer this to the zoning?
Planning Commission. Planning.
Second.
Okay, there's a motion by Councilman Harbin and second by Councilman Roberts. All in favor? Okay. We'll move on down to request number 2. Request consideration of a resolution provide certification as provided by the South Carolina Abandoned Building Revitalization Act for the building and building site at 406, 408, 410, 412, 416, and 420 South Main Street.
I'll go over the item, Dr. Thompson. The J.B. Ferguson Properties owns this building. It's across from City Hall, directly across from City Hall. So it's a project that's been in the works for a while. And they have a, they would like to have commercial and also apartments above. We expect them to submit for a building permit very shortly, maybe in the next couple of weeks, to get that project started. Or restarted again. And so this is a credit that's asked for. We've seen a lot of these for these types of buildings, and I'm going to let City Attorney, Mr. McClain, go through the nature of the credits.
This is a credit for under the Abandoned Buildings Act, which provides for where property's been abandoned for 5 years that they're required to get a certification from the city if that is the case, and they can get an income tax credit is what they're asking for in this situation. These buildings, there was some activity here on the main floor, but there's been nothing in the basements or the second floors for at least 5 years, for as long as I think anybody remember, but that is more than 66% of the building has not been used. So this would qualify as being an abandoned building. That's what they're asking for.
This would improve the back of the building as well, because if you own Murray Avenue and you're looking at these buildings from the back end, they really are in need of help.
Yeah, I went back in. It was a lot larger than I thought they were. Yeah.
That's right.
Any other comments?
Has there been movement taking place recently? I remember years ago when, we originally gave some incentives for that property. I know there was some work going on. A lot of things changed. But is there recent movement on it? Is it kind of...
Yeah, so the recent movement, I mean, back then, of course, they did some facade work. And then there was some structural work that was done underneath within the building. That's kind of hard to tell, but there was some completed in. And there's a pause. The owner sold another piece of property. And so we're anticipating for it to go back underway because they're telling us they're going to submit for a building permit and they have a contractor.
Wait, the motion to approve. Second.
Okay, it's been motion by Councilman Newton and second by Councilman Roberts. All in favor? Aye. Okay. That will be passed on to for consideration. Number 3, request consideration of resolution to provide certification as provided by the South Carolina Abandoned Building Revitalization Act for the building and building site at 106 East Benson Street.
There's been a lot of activity, as you've seen on Benson Street, taking place, and there's been some renovation going from building to building there. This piece of property here is proposed for a coffee shop and apartments above, and they're again asking for the credits since the same legal description with the credits that we have to certify to and city attorney certifies for.
This property.
This one's already been a lot of work done. I think it's a rock shop now.
No. So 106 East Benson is the old attorney's office. It's got a rock facade.
Yes.
It's right next to, it's right next to.
Right next to that bridal.
Yeah, right next to the bridal shop. That's right.
Any other questions?
It's the one right next to Carter Noble and M's office.
It's a few down from that. It's in that same stretch, though. Yeah.
Well, any improvement would be a good thing. I'd like to see that we approve this.
Okay. That motion? Seconded. All in favor? Aye. Okay. The next one is request consideration to purchase body-worn cameras for the police department.
I want to say a couple comments here real quick before I introduce Chief Jim Stuart, that I want to really thank the council. If you go back to 2016, and even before that, there was some limited technology on on body cameras, but our agency, our police agency, led the state in implementing full wide body cameras for our patrol officers, which have greatly, of course, increased transparency, which has been very good for both parties, the citizen and the officer themselves. It's helped in court cases. Certainly, and so here we are. We circle back and we try to keep up with the latest technology. So these were bought back in 2016. Well used, they're used 12 hours a day, each shift. Every police officer has one, and so it's that time again to upgrade our technology and purchase new ones. But I want to say there's still agencies across the state really struggling with even deploying these or even getting them out. And to say that we were leading this in the state, and now we're upgrading and have a request for upgrade for all of them once again, it shows you that we stay on the forefront of this. And Chief Jim Stuart will go through the details of the request for purchase.
I would just add what the city manager said. This was a solicitation last year through the South Carolina Department of Public Safety to put in for new body cameras. While we didn't get the full amount, now we do appreciate, what the state did as far as allocating $40,993 to our agency and purchasing these. We are staying with the same body camera. This is the original one we got, 2016, on the last grant. And like Mr. McEwen said, each officer has one of these, and we also have one in each pod for our detention officers within the detention center. We do like the mobile view camera. It's because we don't pay any monthly cost on it. We buy it, we own it. We have our own way to store the camera. We do purchase enough extra so that if one is damaged or lost, which we hope doesn't happen, we have backups for all our officers. And we're asking for the 125 body-worn cameras in the amount of $66,519. The grant was for $40,993.
Discussion?
Go ahead. Chief, how many officers do we currently have on our force right now? Everybody. Detention and everything.
I think it's easier for me to tell you probably we have 16 openings on the road and 9 openings in the detention center right now.
Let's correct that, though, Chief. There's not 16 openings actually on the road. I looked today at your organizational chart, and that was full. So you have 16 openings. I know you categorize that like that, but within the police department, that's spread out among divisions. So we're operating very efficiently there. And then how many in detention?
We have 9 openings in detention, and like Mr. McEwen said, that's right. Our patrol shifts are full. It's the specialized positions we're holding right now.
I think my question was how many if we were fully staffed, how many would be in the police department? Everybody. Fully staffed.
110 officers on the road, class 1, 32 in the detention center.
110, that's 142. But we're only purchasing 125 cameras for 142 people.
For the detention center, they don't all have cameras. They have one in the pod, so they share cameras.
I was just reading off of the information provided. It says the detention area, all of them wear body cameras. So I was just trying to do the math while we're purchasing less than the number of people we may have on staff. And then my next question is a docking station. A docking station, we're purchasing 18 for 125 cameras. Does a docking station hold more than one camera, to charge? And do we need any more docking stations to make sure, or can we?
The station will hold 15 body cameras, and they'll download in less than 5 minutes. So when they come into roll call, they put their cameras in there, and by the time roll call's over with, their cameras downloaded.
So I guess it's kind of like, when you buy phones, the iPhones, when you get the newer brand, you get some upgrade or enhancement. So the cameras we bought in 2016, we're getting the 2022 cameras, I suppose. Are there any upgrades or enhancements to what we're buying right now versus what we currently have?
This camera was kind of state of the art in 2016. The only thing that's really changed is the design. This one's going to be flatter, probably like you've seen on television or something like that. And they will adhere with a magnetic clip, which is really great. So we may not lose some just from this clip that we have now. But This is, has night vision. We can take photos with it, attach it to reports. It captures all video. Pretty much that technology is still there. The increase in technology is how fast they can download now, which used to take 30 minutes to an hour. Now they can do it in 5 minutes.
Well, I appreciate you answering my question. The only thing I just want to make sure is that are we purchasing enough? Because if we're purchasing them, if we need an additional 15 cameras, now's the time for us to make that decision to make sure we have what we need. But, you know, I'm just doing the math versus employees versus cameras, just making sure they all add up.
Yeah, this is enough for us on the road. And so what they do is they just charge this while they're working in the detention center. Since they don't leave their stations, they just share it. So these cameras in the detention center will run like 24/7.
I have a question. Councilman Stuart asked one of my questions, but the second question deals with the fact that you have how many cameras now?
So we have roughly about 125 cameras. That's what we're.
Are those cameras able to work with these new cameras that we're going to be ordering, or are they totally?
These cameras here, like the one I have, we're trading those in, and we're getting a little bit of a discount for sending those back.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
Chief Stuart, you know, I remember when we got the cameras, and it doesn't seem like it's been that long ago, and, you know, there was a lot of sort of debate on whether you should have it or not, but my hat's off to your leadership and, you know, sort of spearheading that within our department to be transparent for our citizens. So, you know, we've had a lot of incidents happen in the past that have, you know, once they see actually what happened on video, it's sometimes not exactly like you remember. So with that, I'd like to make a recommendation that we purchase these cameras for the police department.
Second.
Okay, and I'd like to add to that, that over the years, we've had really good leadership from Chief Stewart in making sure that all our policemen had adequate cameras. And even when other cities did not have them, our folk did. And so we applaud your leadership in that. So, motion by Councilman Harbin and second by Councilman Lockridge. All in favor?
I just don't really think I got my question answered. I just want to make sure with the number of officers we have, when we're fully staffed, because I'm sure we are going to be at some point, versus the cameras, versus if some get damaged, making sure that we have, because if you're short cameras versus officers right now, then some gets damaged, then you're going to be even more short for the officers for ones being damaged. So I just want to, again, double make sure that you're comfortable. If you're comfortable with it, I'm good with it. But I just want to make sure, give you that leeway if we need more.
Yeah, and I really appreciate Mr. Stewart for asking those questions and making sure they're fully covered. So in this case, you know, you're utilizing the grant, and so you're washing the grant out and you're drawing down those funds, and then we're supplementing that, of course, with $25,000 that's a small portion, of course, their budget. So I mean, if we got to a situation where when you added more officers, or we wanted to overhire because, you know, people move and stuff like that around a good bit on that, I mean, something we could certainly order, you know, 5 or 10 of a bundle and do that throughout the year if we needed to.
Probably be aware of that we still have vacancies on the police force. Is that correct, Chief? Yes, ma'am. Hopefully, Councilman Stewart, we'd get enough to fill out those vacancies and still have enough cameras for those vacancies. So thank you again, Chief Stewart. Okay. The next one, request consideration of an ordinance to establish tree density requirements for a new development. City Manager.
Okay, first I'm going to introduce it real quick, and then I'm going to turn over to Assistant City Manager Andrew Strickland. As you know, we've approved right around almost 2,000 single-family homes over the past year and a half. And so, you know, our growth this year, our growth keeps moving. It's really, and I use the words of our planning director, it's been an evolution for all of us, and the development standards that the city has as far as going forward with new developments. A lot's come out of that. One of the things was that, we kind of beat the developers to slab homes being built, which a lot of times leads to stormwater issues because they're built straight on grade, or there are grade issues that occur afterwards, and the developers nowhere to be found. And so that was a development standard that was recommended by former council member, of course, that was an architect, and Councilmember Roberts, among the support of the council members here tonight. Many other things that have been added within the development standards as we've gone forward, and that it just enhances the development, from landscaping to not having a house directly across from an intersection so lights don't shine into it, all of which has again increased and provided for a quality development that's going to be here really forever, right? Once that development's there. So it's really important to get it right from the beginning. There's some cities across the state that are just taking whatever they get. We're way past that point. We're the point where you can make sure it fits in the community. We're at the point where over the last year you have adopted enough variety houses to make sure we're in a good situation as far as housing and housing inventory coming on the market. So I just want to make those points out, that this again is a request from council to staff to take a look at. We've had different editions of this provided to you guys, and based on y'all's recommendations have been incorporated into this for all new future development. It'll certainly enhance the development quality, and you see many other cities that have this across the state, and again, I think we should be a leader and be involved in having this as well. And Andrew Strickland has a lot of experience in this area and developed the ordinance. So, Mr. Strickland.
Thank you, Mr. McEwen. Council, Mayor Pro Tem, as you have before you here, this is a request for first reading for a new ordinance for the city of Anderson that would establish minimum tree density requirements for all new developments. It would affect commercial development and residential development equally. For commercial development, and forgive me, the language in the write-up here is a little misleading. This would affect new commercial development and new residential development, but it would also bind existing commercial development. Those are, you see on Clemson Boulevard or Highway 81, something like that. It would require a tree survey prior to development, which would identify existing trees on the site. The purpose being to save large trees and save existing trees that are on the site and prevent clear cutting or what's known as mass grading of a site. Overall tree density required is 130 caliper inches per acre. A caliper inch is a common way to measure the size of a tree. So you get more credit essentially for larger trees than for smaller trees. And then additionally, there's an incentive for saving large specimen trees, and those are identified in the code. Typically for an oak tree, that's anything 24 inches or larger. So that's a pretty significant size tree, and those are what we've seen and what we've heard throughout the community is something worth saving in a development. For residential development, again, like I said, mass grading of new subdivisions is essentially eliminated. I think what you see in a lot of new developments now is really just grading the property to get the home sites ready for construction to start immediately. This would set some minimum tree density requirements that have to be saved throughout the life of the development. So if there are any existing trees on the site at the time of development, they would have to be saved. A minimum 130 inches per acre would have to be saved throughout the development. And then each individual building lot after that would have to meet minimum tree density requirement as well. And that's stipulated in the code. New home sites, like I said, required to maintain that 130 inches, or there's another calculation for new home sites that gives an allowance for planting maybe a smaller tree, but it's a type of tree that gets larger over the years. So there's an allowance for that as well. And then importantly to you guys, there's a penalty that would go into effect for removing specimen trees, especially. And the penalty being 8 times the caliper inches that are removed. They have to be replanted on the site. or would be paid into a city tree fund to be used in the area around where that offense happened. And again, the penalty for all other sites that aren't, and all other trees that are not specimen trees would be replacing the minimum caliper inches that are lost somewhere on the site. Again, staff recommends approval on first reading, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you got.
Questions, comments? Council? Councilman Roberts?
I'll start. I'm sure there are other questions. Really, the root of all of this is, what do we want our city to look like in the future? And we're seeing a period of growth that we haven't seen in a long time. Let's get ahead of it. I will publicly state that I've been trying to do something about the practice of mass grading. That is probably one of my top goals here, is to curtail or severely limit the way we mass grade sites. When I say mass grade, I mean when you go in and you take every tree off of it, you essentially flatten it, and then you build house pads to put houses on. And we've lost some very beautiful property in that practice. So primarily it's, what do you want your city to look like going forward in the future? And this is simply a tool to achieve what I say is the curtailment or the elimination of mass grading. It does more than that, besides the obvious, preserving trees. But it also preserves topography. You can't grade around trees without altering topography. So you've got this beautiful rolling landscape in our upstate. So it also prevents from just flattening these beautiful sites, and it also helps preserve natural features. You know, whether they're hills, valleys, rock escarpments, just those sort of things. It just helps protect that. I don't want this to be seen as punitive. I think there are plenty of exemptions in here, and that leads to another question that I may just have to come back to an answer. But there are a number of exemptions listed here, and I can't possibly think of every exemption that may exist. But one just popped into my mind prior to this meeting. But let's just say there's an athletic field. Certainly don't have trees on an athletic field, but that's not listed in the exemptions. But there ought to be a process to add or request exemptions that we haven't even thought of. Finally, and then I'll open it up to other questions, but I don't know what 130 caliper inches per acre looks like. Someone would have to show me. I'll yield. Let someone else have a question.
Question?
That's the question I had about 130 caliper inches. I don't even know what that is. Mm-hmm. Second thing is, you said you don't want this to be punitive, but at the same time, we want people to be fined enough so that they will not cut these beautiful trees down. Do we have any fee scales for that type of thing? Or is it just, we're going to make it up as we go along?
I'm sorry, ask that question one more time.
Do we have some fees set up for this particular fines for somebody who has a beautiful oak that's been there 100 years, and they just say, well, the heck with it, I'm going to go ahead and cut it down? What are the punitive?
So we'll take a site, for example, that happened recently somewhere in the city on Highway 81. There's some pretty big live oaks that were taken out, and they were in excess of, I'd say, 30 caliper inches each, which is a good size tree for sure. And it would qualify as a specimen tree as part of this code. So say they were 30 inches, the penalty for taking a tree out like that without a permit is 8 times the caliper inches. So you're going to make me do math here in the meeting. So essentially 240 caliper inches would have to be replaced for one tree. So that would be mixed between replantings on the site, and we'd have to work with the property owner to make sure that there's room on the property for caliper inches to be placed, but most likely 240 caliper inches is not going to fit on the site. So I mean, that's essentially, so some of those trees, for instance, some of the trees that we're planting on Market Street, that we planted on Market Street here as part of the streetscape, those are 6-inch caliper trees. So, you know, 240 caliper inches, that's a lot of 6-inch trees that would have to fit on a site, and it practically can't be done. So we're going to have to come up with a fee per caliper inch based on current nursery prices at the time. We don't necessarily want to set that in the code. I mean, for instance, you'll typically pay $250 for a 2.5-inch tree at a nursery, potentially 2.5, 3-inch tree. So we can extrapolate that down to a per caliper inch price that could be paid.
Based on the price of the trees.
That's right. It would have to be flexible based on the price. And we wouldn't necessarily want to set that in a policy document. We want that to kind of float and be able to negotiate that with the property owner and the nursery at the time. But the crux of the matter would be, and the language in the code says this as well, is that you can't just pay to cut down a tree. You can't just pay the penalty, right? Because the goal of the ordinance is to create long-lasting tree canopy throughout the city, right? So if everybody chopped down large trees and just paid the fee, you know, we're left with a lot of money that we can replant trees, but it gets rid of that character that we ultimately lost there at the end. So there's got to be a balance of replanting and then fee associated with that cutting.
Andrew, could you explain to me what a specimen tree is as opposed to some, you know, just scrubby old tree? What's a
We've got a definition for a specimen tree, but we don't have a definition for a scrubby old tree. I'm sorry.
Be cut down, I guess.
It depends. A specimen tree depends on the type of tree and how quickly they grow. So something that grows really slowly, say a dogwood. Dogwoods grow really slowly and they stay pretty. Dogwood tree, yes, ma'am. You see those everywhere. Those are really slow growing trees and they stay pretty small. So we're saying anything that's 8 inches or larger in a dogwood tree is considered a specimen tree. So that's like that. And if you can imagine a dogwood tree that gets that big, that's a pretty big dogwood tree, right? I mentioned those live oaks that were in front of the old Rite Aid. So a specimen live oak would be 24 inches in diameter if you measured those 4.5 inches or 4.5 feet off the ground, which is diameter of breast height. And so, I mean, that's something that big. That's a significant size tree. For a pine tree, that's a 30-inch tree. Those are quick growing trees, so they tend to get a little bit larger.
But if there's and I've noticed that going across any areas that Duke Energy will sometimes recommend that you cut a tree down because it's going to fall on the wires or whatever. So would there be anything that you could say, well, this tree is a nuisance. It's going to fall when there's a storm. It's going to hit this power line. That tree can be cut down, right?
Yes, ma'am. There's some broad exemptions for utility companies protecting their lines. They have the ability to do that. Yes, ma'am. But I will say they've been really good to work with us in special cases, especially most recently on Boulevard. There's some big trees that were subject to some of their pruning, and they were able to work with us to make sure they weren't too bad.
I just want to, just for a point of clarity for everybody, we're not talking about existing residential properties that you have that at your house right now. You know, you can do what you want to at your house. This is for new development and for existing and commercial development or new commercial development.
So this would apply to all commercial development, existing and new, but only new residential development and new home development.
Anything that our citizens have at their house, on their property now, this doesn't affect them.
Is that true?
Yes,
Correct. That's exempted. It's mentioned first in the exemptions, I believe.
It is.
It's the last one. So, you know, we approved this here tonight. Getting back to Councilman Roberts' question, you know, we have a great university, Anderson University, who's really growing by leaps and bounds and building athletic fields everywhere. And are there, would there be exemptions, since it's not, I guess, detailed in here, we would leave that open for negotiation. How would we handle that?
No, it's not specifically called out in the code as an exemption for an athletic facility per se. But typically, those facilities aren't done on individual lots. So the field limits aren't just the property line, right? The property lines aren't just the field limits. It's part of a larger complex. So we look at the larger complex to make sure that the tree density requirements are met. And for a place like Anderson University, they do a great job of maintaining tree canopy and replenishing and replanting tree canopy. So, we'd certainly look at that. I'd stop short of saying we needed to exempt them, because they would probably volunteer to comply with the code anyway, right? Because they have the same goal that the city does in that case. So we would just look holistically at the entire development to make sure that it met the spirit of the law.
How would we monitor that? Monitor that. I mean, you can monitor, if you do development, that's not a problem. Community, how would we monitor whether or not a tree that's in somebody's yard and been there, as Tony mentioned, for several years, and you decide you want to cut it down?
So if it is a new lot that's created after this code is adopted, it would apply. So it would have to comply with the code.
Already there, and the house is there, everything's there.
So if the lot is already there, if the house is already there, if the lot's already there at the day the ordinance is adopted, it's exempt from the requirements of this code. So if say your house, say anybody's house that's sitting in here right now, they would be exempted from the code. But this would affect any new lots, new residential lots moving forward.
Regardless of, because like in a lot of our wards, we go in and, there's a lot of dilapidated houses that get torn down. And because the houses were so close together, it may take two lots to create one new lot back. So they may need to be some cutting, I guess, to be able to infill back into our inner city. So would that apply? Because we have a lot of agencies like Home for Hope or Habitat for Humanity that comes in that we donate lots to kind of build back in the inner city. And would that apply on those lots where we as a city go in and tear the houses down and then they become vacant lots, or is it exempt from that as well?
It would apply. That'd be a new home that's built. But I will say it's usually their practice to plant back trees as part of new construction. So I wouldn't have any issues saying that they could meet that requirement.
Yeah, I think to answer your question too on that. So yeah, right, it applies. But say you're trying to build two of those lots and there's the oak trees in the way, right? So you need to cut the oak tree down. So you get a permit from us, cut the oak tree down, and then you replant back to the calculation of this ordinance. So it would still allow you to build a house and then get the tree canopy goals of the city and not just have that eliminated for that neighborhood. Right. And the other thing to keep in mind, this has actually been very beneficial to us, and you hadn't seen this in a lot of county development. There's a lot of county development out there right now. You just don't see trees at all in the developments. We've required trees to be added in development. So even if it was being built in a hayfield, and trees are, part of the document, which we've been doing those as, planned development districts, it requires certain trees and street trees. And you can see some successes of that already where the trees have matured and really created, what would have been just a row of houses or so forth, made it a really nice street lined, tree lined, street. And so the other protection we have a protection right now in the PDD document that says, you have to stay on top of that because you could have a neighbor or somebody just come across and say, well, I just don't like this tree because I don't like doing leaves anymore, in the fall, and just cut that down. The next guy does it again, and then you lose your goals that you initially had, the PDD document. So that has to be watched. And then this just really adds to it because it adds to it on, as Mr. Roberts said, on the goals of new development and developing using the natural resources that are already there and trying to protect those as much as possible, right? And then if you can't, of course you're going to be able to protect some more than somebody incentivized to. Then you would plant more and create the tree canopies. And so it's just, again, adding more to it.
Let me follow up on the appeals process. Is there an appeals process, and who does that go before?
Right. So it's important that there be some sort of ability to add some flexibility to the code. And so right now, the way it's written, our planning director, Maurice McKenzie, would be the appeals process. Ultimately, it would go through the Board of Zoning Appeals also if his opinion was disputed. But we really want to make staff the appeal, the initial appeal process, right? So
It goes to the...
it goes to the Board of Zoning Appeals and the Circuit Court, right? Yep.
Normal government so it first goes to an administrative official, take a look at it, make a judgment call, and then they can appeal that. Board of Zoning Appeals, and then if there's a real disagreement, appeal it to the Circuit Court on the matter of fact, that not opinion, right? So it's on the matter of fact when you appeal. So you see very limited amount of appeals to the Circuit Court, just because it's typically on opinion, not factual basis.
One.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Comment, then I'd like some response perhaps, but the recompense plantings, let's say there's an industry that wants to come in and they have to really clear a site, level it, and all the trees go. And how do we then work with them to identify plantings that may be on another site, that maybe it's a project that we want to see done elsewhere?
And I think that's where the flexibility of that city tree fund is going to come into play, because I mean, industrial sites are large sites, and so typically there's a lot of clearing that goes on. But there's also a lot of room to replant typically in the future as well after development. Anything that can't fit on the site could obviously be paid into the tree fund, like we talked about earlier, to help establish some goals in the long run for the city.
So, I think you may have answered it just a minute ago, but throughout the document it says the director, McKenzie?
That's right, the planning director, that's right.
So he would have the flexibility to look at each project individually to see what's going to be permitted and what's not going to be permitted, and what kind of, because, I mean, right now, if you buy a piece of land that's dead flat, nothing except grass, and develop it, you have to have a tree, I mean, you have to replant certain trees for
Right.
certain things that we have. Have we looked at the, I know that, the phrase unfunded mandate we hate when it comes to something that we have to do that, we don't know. And have we looked, and so that's sort of how, I'm for trees, I like rolling hills, but have we looked at the cost it's going to cost the developer to implement this, in addition to, it's sort of like an unfunded mandate. We're putting more rules on our developers, which I'm not saying I'm against, but have we looked at the cost that's going to implement to them?
So a couple of things that I see, at least right off the bat. On the front side, a tree survey is required to be done. And typically that's going to be done by a surveyor, right? So while they're out there surveying the property, getting the topography for the property prior to designing, they're going to take an inventory of the trees out there. And really what we're looking for there are identifying large trees that are to be saved. The code allows some sampling methods to be done for large areas, say large areas of pine trees. You're going to take those out anyway. You don't need to count each individual one. So that allows some savings there. So typically tree surveys, in my experience, have been anywhere from $1,500 to $4,500 additional to the cost of the survey, just depending on the size of the property. Obviously, the larger the property, the higher that fee is going to be. And then really it just depends on the number of trees that have to go back. And we add some flexibility, obviously, in the size of the tree that has to be replanted back. Say you buy a hay field and you have to plant trees back. you're going to have to obviously plant and pay for a lot more trees than somebody who's going to develop a piece of property that's already got big trees on it, right? So we're not saying you have to plant a certain size tree. We're just saying you have a tree density, and trees grow, right? So it's not going to have to look like an old site on day one. Trees are allowed to grow, and we want that canopy over a period of time. So you can plant smaller trees at a higher rate, a higher density, or you can plant fewer large trees. So I mean, it's what that balance looks like, right? And it just depends on each site.
That's what I think, with this ordinance, as long as it has the flexibility built in, to be flexible, because, I mean, we can't be the tree police. And, like when we have a new development and they meet our standards, they would be no longer under this ordinance, is the way it's written. Or is it going to be that we write this ordinance, I buy a house that was built by a developer in 6 months, does that mean I fall under this ordinance?
That's right. Any lot, any
year from now, in a new development, I have to get permission from the city before I cut down a tree in my property on my yard.
Yeah, and you got to do that anyways, really, because so we're doing planned development districts that goes back to my point of that says you're gonna have a tree in the front yard, a tree along a street tree, right? Well, that's to be maintained. It's not to be cut down.
PDD document. I'm saying.
Level of development we're bringing in.
Just said, let's say on the ABC streets, they build a house on a double lot, and they don't have to plant a tree, but there's trees there. They can't cut down a tree without getting a survey done and permission from the city to cut the tree down?
Right, so they would get a permit to cope if they needed to cut a tree down, say it was decayed or whatever. They would get a permit to do that. A staff member would go out there, take a look at it, and then, replant another tree. So that's the essential part of that.
Who's going to monitor this tree business?
Our code enforcement.
I mean, it's under the planning development division, but you have code enforcement officers and zoning officials that will take a look at that.
Before this ordinance gets adopted, I can do anything I want, but the day after it, I can't cut down a tree in my own yard on my own property without getting permission.
Well, the other thing we have too currently are heritage tree districts. So all of our historic districts basically, plus a few others. So Boulevard, North Anderson, Lindley Park area, North Street where I live. I mean, that's in a tree district. So I've got to get permission now.
Exactly.
Already without this new ordinance. I've got to get permission anyway to, yeah.
I'm going to interrupt something here. I had 2 trees to get old, needed to be cut down. And I simply talked to Maurice and told him what I was going to have to do. He said, just go ahead and, since they're old, since they're dying, we can go ahead and do that. But I replanted in place of them 2 other trees, younger trees, that will be someday as pretty and big as those are. So I don't know that there's a problem, and I'd like to see this ordinance established. So this ordinance.
And I just want to, clarify one. If you have an existing house on a lot right now, you can cut down a tree. It's just if you have a vacant lot and you're getting ready to build a new house where this ordinance kicks in. So if I want to go out and close on a house that's already built, it don't matter. But if I want to go close on a lot and I'm getting ready to build a brand new house, then that's when the ordinance kicks in.
That's right.
That's on the request that council made to us. Gave us that direction to put that in here.
That's right. Yes, sir. And I guess before we vote on it, the only other question that I have is that, and I know it's a lot of flexibility, and Andrew done a great job putting this together, really appreciate it, because like Councilman Robert said, I think we want to formulate how our city looks. We want to be out in front of it instead of coming up trying to change it once it's already there. But what about cemeteries? Somebody wants to expand. I know we've got the city-owned cemeteries. So I'm looking at New Silverbrook. We're getting ready to clean a lot of trees out there to create new lots. what do we do as a city? Do we put money back in the bank to go build, to put in a tree bank, to put trees somewhere else because we're cutting down all those trees? What happens to us? I know we're telling the developers, but we're doing the same, so how does it apply to us as a city?
I'm really glad you asked that question, but I don't want to spill all the beans before budget season. So you'll see something in the budget. No, so that's a great point. So, and I'll stand on my soapbox for a second. Historic Silverbrook Cemetery is one of our best assets we have in the city. It's got a lot of really old trees that are starting to die. Just not because they've been poorly maintained. They're just old. I mean, trees die, and these trees are right at the time limit of their lifespan. So we're coming up with tree replacement and maintenance plans at Old Silverbrook and New Silverbrook cemeteries, just to maintain that aesthetic. So we're putting our money where our mouth is as a city for sure, especially in regard to our city or our cemeteries and larger pieces of property, but also in our streetscapes too. You notice we don't put in dinky little trees, 2-inch trees that you can get at Lowe's or Home Depot. We're putting in some pretty sizable trees that create a good citywide aesthetic.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem, I'll second the motion.
Who made the motion? Okay, Councilman Lockridge made the motion,
And I do want to say to Councilman Roberts, we appreciate the effort that you put in as well, because we know that this is something we want our city to look in the future like we want it to look. We don't want it to be clear-cut. We don't want it to be just looking like a flat piece of land. We want some beauty around us as well. So thank you for your work on this.
I would agree. Thank you, and I appreciate Andrew doing all his work. My point is that if it's never going to be a problem other than PDD documents, it probably can be addressed in that document. If the argument is that it's never going to be a problem because only development is PDD, then it can be addressed in the PDD document, not in an ordinance that casts a wide net over everybody. I'd like to consider that in first or second reading.
Something to think about. I also think about custom home developments or custom homes, single site. Issues that could arise. Not everybody's going to agree. I'm probably going to have concerns, issues of my own. But I am for doing something. I've been pushing for years as well to really move forward with something. So seconding what Mr. Harbin just said, I think maybe a little further discussion in between now and second reading may be warranted, but that.
One thing to Mr. Harbin's comment. So let's take the Canterbury property, right? Canterbury property, Concord, Canterbury.
Grayland.
Exactly.
Right. So that doesn't have to be a PDD. I mean, it's zoned R20. So they could go in, clear all the trees, build houses, and, it's under the old
Trees, or save all the big trees if we don't have this.
This, right. They just clear it.
We can do about it.
Nothing you can do about it. And put single-family houses on R20 because it's already zoned for R20. So, this was partly at, we've evolved, right? But that was one that was in front of us, and that was a serious consideration to that piece of property that we realized, hey, we have an issue here.
And I get that, but I didn't say, you brought it up that because I was trying to think of an example, and that's a perfect one, like the ABC streets or wherever that we have 2 lots and there's trees. If somebody comes in and builds one house on that, we're going to tell them from this day forward, you can't cut a tree down on your own property unless you get a permit. And that's a little bit, I don't feel 100% comfortable with that. I'm not saying we're not, we want to eliminate mass grading. That's the whole purpose of this, is to eliminate, like Councilman Roberts, I agree from day one. I don't want to see it, dead flat, fill dirt be put in, and build these houses, and then we throw a couple of new trees. That's the reason for the ordinance. It's just tastes a little bit funny to me that somebody's going to tell me whether I can cut my tree down that I own or not. And I got to get over that, I guess.
It'll whether you own just that one or two lots that you gotta cut, you know, if you mentioned ABC Street, if you had those two lots with one tree that are vacant, that you wanted to build a lot, there's no different than if you own 20 acres and you wanna go cut down 30 trees. You still own that 30 acres, or you own this half an acre, either way, but again, I think it's,
I mean, if you want to put a garden on your 30 acres, you can't do it because you can't cut down the trees.
unless you do a tree survey.
What would you suggest then to remedy that?
I don't know. I mean, I think this is a great step. I don't know that we, you know, I think what brought us to the table, you know, was some annexation that we've done with PDD documents, and we got caught, you know, not watching everything in the PDD that said they couldn't mass grade, and they mass graded.
And they mass grade.
I mean, that's what brought us really to where we're at today, but we could have put documentation in that PDD that said, you've got it, we got it, they got to plant them back, but they didn't have to save them. Because we can put anything in a PDD document that we want.
Right, they gotta plant them back, there was existing nice trees there that were taken out. Right.
That we don't, you know, that we look, I mean, you know, I'm for growth, and I'm for rolling hills. I mean, I was picturing the stuff you were describing, and that's the Anderson I want too. And, you know, how do we get there as a government, as putting a mandate on somebody? You know, we're going to have to look at that. I mean, I'm fine passing it tonight and just further discussion about it before second reading.
Well, one other thing to throw in here, have you priced getting a tree cut down?
Yes.
Do you know about what it costs?
It's very expensive.
Very expensive. So if you cut a tree down, you're gonna really want that tree down. So I think, you know, it's a situation where I really think if somebody really wants the tree down that bad, and they're willing to pay that kind of money to get the tree cut down in the first place, that it would fit right into this. I really don't think that, if I had, like I said, I had 2 trees that I had to cut down, I'll replace them both, which was no big deal. But they're not the big trees that they were. I mean, I had one.
But under this ordinance, you would have to put money into the fund if he fell under this ordinance.
Not under this ordinance.
You have to replace the caliper inches that, yeah, right, yeah, for somebody new, yeah, right.
Yeah.
This is a worthy discussion, you know, and I'm thinking both pro and con. I'm thinking more not so much as new residences, but old places where people have been living for years. And I think that you said that would not necessarily, you know, cause them to pay to have a tree cut down in their yard that's been there for years. Now, of course, he wanted yours down. I mean, I want mine down, see. Old neighborhoods, been there for years, and I don't feel like nobody can come in there and tell me you cut your tree down.
But Dr. Thompson, For new residents.
Yeah, for new residents, fine. I mean, old folk, you know, who've been there for years.
I think anytime you treat two different people, citizens that will live in the city of Anderson with 2 different sets of rules, you get into a little bit of a gray area.
But Dr. Thompson, you know as well as I do, you know, the areas that we represent the most is that if we went into the Alphabet Street, and of course, you know, there are 2 houses that were burnt out, and it was a vacant piece of land, and somebody wanted to build back. I'd much rather see
Cut the tree down.
I'd much rather see more trees put back in that neighborhood, because it's going to beautify that street instead of having all these mill houses stacked on top of each other.
That's where you're building a new house. Like,
That's
you're
right.
building a new house,
That's
that's fine, put the tree there. But now, if you've been living there, you don't, you know, you've been there, and you got a tree in your yard, or you don't have a tree in your yard. I love trees too. You know, I think it's a wonderful thing. I just don't want to mandate things that tell people what you got to do about your own tree.
I agree. But if it's new construction.
If it's new construction, that makes a difference.
That's right.
We have a first and we have a
Yeah,
I think,
motion
in
and a
further discussion too, I think we're going to really need to consider the enforcement of this. I mean,
yeah, who's going to monitor all of this?
realistic and
big job. Yeah, Maurice?
Well, More checks and balances to that too, because we have stormwater inspectors that are always inspecting the sites. So that adds them in. Public Works is involved in it, engineers involved in it. So it goes beyond the plan and development division. There's other checks and balances. When our building officials go out there and they're inspecting the site, they're inspecting the house or building. So, I mean, we all work together, and there's a good communication flow between all our different divisions on those type of inspections.
All in favor? Motion passes. On first reading, is that correct?
First reading, yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Discussion, wasn't it? Okay, number 6, request consideration of a referral to the Planning Commission and ordinance amended section 1413 of the zoning ordinance.
First, let me say I'm glad the Boy Scouts are here tonight to witness a really good discussion. That was a great discussion by council. This may lead into another one. I'm not sure, but anyways, this is something that was identified recently again, and looking at what you want the city to be, and realizing that there was essentially a loophole in being able to bring in and live in and rent out RVs within the city. So this takes that on. We do have language in our zoning ordinance that recognizes that. However, there's some holes in it as well. And of course, you're aware, and I think you tasked us with taking a look at this. So Maurice McKenzie, asked him to talk about this item to you, and then we can answer questions.
Thank you. It's sometimes necessary to refine the language of the zoning ordinance in order to maintain its efficiency because of changes in laws, community needs or conditions, a lot of other factors. And as Mr. McEwen mentioned, we're looking at a specific section of the zoning ordinance, section 14.13 to be specific. It currently says that it prohibits the use of campers, recreation vehicles, and equipment for living, sleeping, housekeeping purposes when parked on a lot in a residential district. Now, what we are looking into and recommending that we amend that ordinance, just a couple of words, but again, it triggers the need to go through the process, basically saying that to prohibit the use of campers, recreation vehicles, and equipment for housekeeping purposes on any property inside the city, not just residential properties inside the city. But again, a couple of words different makes a big difference. And in order to refine the zoning ordinance and to amend it, it has to go through the same process that you're familiar with a rezoning. It's advertised, it goes through the Planning Commission, and ultimately comes back to you. So that's what we're recommending, that you refer this to the Planning Commission for consideration. They will consider this at their April 5th meeting, so this will come back to you at one of your meetings in April.
Yeah, and let me add too, I should have added as part of my introduction that, again, this is a referral. The ordinance is yet to be put together in context for the Planning Commission, which will study that and then, of course, make any changes, recommendations, and for that to you for first and second reading considerations. So we just wanted to add that the background sheet just in front of you is not a context of what the zoning ordinance language will be. It's a framework to go to the Planning Commission to be developed and come back to you.
Sounds good. Would you give me an example, Maurice,
Of
people putting the RVs or whatever on property?
instances in the city from time to time where people may be living in a camper on a lot behind a house or sometimes in a commercial district. So we have certain guidelines through our code enforcement that can regulate this, but this gives it more specific teeth to help us state that you can't live in a camper in a residential or commercial or industrial district for that matter. Also, this will help better coordinate with our residential building codes, as Mr. McEwen was mentioning about housing types, things like that. So it's really twofold.
Let me ask a question. If somebody, let's say, is visiting a friend and they have a camper and they come into their friend and pull in their driveway and plug up, Is that considered part of this?
Technically not allowed, and particularly with an RV in the front yard, they're not allowed except for a 24-hour period when you're loading or unloading or cleaning it out or something like that. If you have a camper or an RV and it's not being used, it needs to be stored in the side or the rear yard.
They would have to go to a camping ground or something like that?
Speaking, yes.
So I talked to Councilmember Jeff Roberts. I need to keep in mind the bunch of Roberts. But Councilmember Jeff Roberts earlier today about this issue, and also the issue if, say, an ice storm came through and that's you had an RV that was properly stored behind your house, or to the side of the house, and met zoning. Could you use it? Of course, we would want you to use it. You know, it's contained. Most of them have generators, that type of thing. So there was some notes I took down that we would add to the actual ordinance because we would want them to use it, right? And that's something we can take a look at too, Mr. Lawford, as far as if somebody's visiting for a night. What we're trying to prevent is what you see in counties like Lawrence County that don't have zoning. You'll see it a lot around Lake Greenwood. If you go to Cross Hill area, people are permanently living in an RV that's not built to residential code, and it's just built to really just an organization's code that they put together. It was just a lobbying organizations for RVs that they made their own code for. And mobile homes, even that are separate from RVs, are built. HUD stepped in because they were not built to codes that were acceptable, and there was a lot of fires and a lot of entrapments in those. They stepped in and required special manufacturing standards for mobile homes. The federal government hasn't stepped in and standardized that for RVs. So again, it's an association that created their own standard that they refer to. So that was something that was brought up, and again, this is to prevent people living in them and rent them out, say an Airbnb. Living in them permanently, temporarily, or rent them out for a week to somebody. That's really what's to prevent. And it's pretty devastating when you see it in Lawrence County and other places. Hundreds of them in a field, and each of them hooked up to, a utility pole, and people are living in them permanently, and then a tornado comes through or a bad storm comes through, and these things aren't anchored down correctly, and the codes aren't there. You can get entrapped in them, and they catch on fire. And so that's why this is being proposed.
If somebody, like I said, if somebody's visiting a friend or somebody who is in the city and just want to plug up for a short period of time, I don't see there should be a problem there.
Yeah, and I think we can make a exception for that, no problem. And once we put the ordinance together.
The ones that aren't there several mobile home parks in the city that some campers reside in currently?
Not campers, mobile homes. Yeah.
One mobile home in the city.
There's only one Mimosa. Market Street.
That's Mimosa.
An area off Old Williamson Road, Cedar Ridge.
So apply to one of those. Let's say you have very similar to what you're talking about, but let's say first quality. Yeah, a lot of people brought mobile homes in. Campers in, temporary labor. They're here for 3 months. They left.
So
the parks that are permitted or the areas that are permitted for.
Yeah, it would prevent that in the city. But I will say I've talked to companies that workers do that, and what they typically do is stay at a campground. And they stay at a campground that has proper hookups and everything else, and state park or whatever, and they're welcome to do that. So I understand what you're saying, but that wouldn't be allowed in the city to go set up and then be able to stay there for a couple months.
What would happen with people who's doing that right now? Would they be grandfathered in, or if this passes, or will we be able to get those out?
It's really legal as it stands right now. There was some argument about a certain classification in the zoning ordinance, and Marisha can help me out with this, that it could be argued, such as a fairground, that they could be allowed, when that's really outdated language. The fairgrounds talking about when you see the carnival workers coming in, they have campers and they stay there 3-4 nights while the, or 2 weeks or whatever, while the carnival's going on. So that's kind of the argument we're up against, is that there was some language in that. And Maurice, if you want to add to that.
Well, I guess what I'm saying, our current ordinance says it's prohibited on, or stored on a residential lot. But what if they're stored on commercial lots now, living? Are they grandfathered in, or in the city if we pass this, or what happens to those people who's doing that now on commercial lots?
Again, in our code enforcement guidelines, there are other sections that could apply to that type of use in a commercial district. So we think we have enough guidelines to prohibit that anyway. However, this would strengthen that and make everything more consistent.
I make a motion that we approve it. The amendment of section 1413 of the zoning ordinance.
So we're just recommending to planning.
To planning, for planning. Make a motion, we refer it to the planning commission.
Okay, a motion by Councilman Stuart and second by Councilman Lockridge. All in favor? Passes to be referred to the Planning and Zoning Commission. Items to be discussed.
Make the motion to adjourn.
Motion by Councilman, and second by Councilman Roberts that we adjourn. All in favor? All right, thank you for coming.
No.
David. David.
Get on that.